The massive station floated in the darkness above Arcturus Prime, its silver hull reflecting the light of 3 nearby stars. Inside the main chamber, representatives from 12 different alien species sat in their designated seats, ranged in a perfect circle around a single platform at the center. The air felt heavy with tension as Ambassador G1 stepped onto that platform. Her black uniform, marking her as the sole representative of humanity. She looked small compared to the towering aliens around her. The Vrenix matriarch stood nearly 3 meters tall, her 4 arms crossed over her crystalline chest. The Thoque representatives resembled giant insects, their compound eyes watching GON without blinking. Other species filled the chamber, each one ancient and powerful, each one united in their displeasure with humanity. The matriarch's voice echoed through the chamber, translated instantly into hundreds of languages by the station's systems. She began listing humanity's crimes against galactic order. Humans had established colonies on 47 worlds without proper authorization. They had built warships that exceeded the limits set for new species. They had refused to share their artificial intelligence research with the Council's science division. They had disrupted trade agreements that had stood for thousands of years. G-1 listened without moving, her face showing nothing. She had expected this. Earth had known for months that the Council was preparing to put humanity on trial. The other species saw humans as aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerous. They wanted humanity brought under control before they became too powerful to manage. The matriarch continued speaking, her tone growing harsher. Humanity had been welcomed into galactic civilization only 70 years ago, yet they acted as if they owned the stars. They expanded too quickly, learned too fast, and refused to accept their place as junior members of an ancient order. The Council had been patient, but that patience had limits. Around the chamber, other representatives added their voices. The Thoque ambassador spoke of human mining operations that violated environmental treaties. The Kelroth delegate complained about human traders undercutting established markets. One by one, they presented their cases, building a wall of accusations that seemed impossible to defend against. Finally, Matriarch delivered the Council's judgment. Humanity would immediately cease all colonial expansion. They would reduce their military fleet to 1/10 of its current size. They would open all their research facilities to Council inspection. They would pay reparations to species affected by their actions. They would accept permanent restrictions on their voting rights within the Council. They had 30 standard days to begin compliance. The chamber fell silent, waiting for G1's response. Every species in the room expected her to negotiate, to plead for better terms, to ask for more time. Some hoped she would refuse outright, giving them an excuse to enforce the judgment through military action. None of them expected what actually happened. G-1 took a deep breath and spoke clearly into the silence. Humanity rejected the Council's terms. All of them. Every single condition was unacceptable. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no discussion. The matriarch leaned forward, her crystalline features showing confusion. She asked if G1 understood the consequences of refusal. The Council had the power to enforce its will. Humanity's small fleet could not stand against the combined might of 12 ancient civilizations. G1 nodded slowly. She understood perfectly. That was why humanity was choosing a different option. Effective immediately, Earth and all human colonies were withdrawing from galactic civilization completely. Every human ship, station, and settlement would be evacuated within 60 days. Humanity would remove itself from Council space entirely. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives shouted over each other, some in anger, others in disbelief. The matriarch demanded silence, but it took several minutes before order returned. She asked G1 if this was a negotiating tactic, a bluff designed to force the Council to reconsider. G1's answer was simple and final. It was not a bluff. Even as they spoke, human vessels across the galaxy were beginning evacuation procedures. Within hours, every human presence in Council space would be in motion. Heading for the galactic rim and beyond, the Thoque ambassador slammed one of his limbs against his seat, creating a loud crack that echoed through the chamber. He declared that the Council would not permit humanity to simply leave. They would be stopped, forced to stay, and accept the judgment passed upon them. G1 turned to face the insectoid alien directly. She asked a simple question. By what right would they stop free beings from leaving? Humanity had never sworn permanent loyalty to the Council. They had joined as equals, and they would leave as equals. Any attempt to prevent their departure would be considered an act of war. The Kelroth delegate tried a different approach. He spoke softly, reasonably, pointing out that withdrawal would hurt humanity more than the Council. Humans depended on galactic trade, on access to established routes and markets. They had colonies scattered across Council space that could not simply be abandoned. G1's response was cold. Humanity would take everything they had built and destroy everything they could not carry. Not one piece of human technology, not one human installation, not one human citizen would remain in Council space. The galaxy would get exactly what it wanted, a future without human interference. She turned back to the matriarch and delivered her final statement. The Council had spent 70 years treating humanity as children who needed guidance. They had placed restrictions on human growth while offering nothing but condescension in return. They had demanded obedience while providing no partnership. They had made their choice, and now humanity was making theirs. The matriarch tried to respond. But GUN was already walking toward the exit. She did not ask for permission to leave. She did not bow or show any sign of respect to the Council she was abandoning. She simply left, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet chamber. Behind her, the representatives began arguing among themselves. Some insisted this was indeed a bluff, that humans would return begging for mercy once they realized their mistake. Others worried that humanity might actually follow through, though they could not imagine what that would mean for galactic stability. A few understood immediately that they had made a terrible error, but their voices were lost in the noise. Outside the station, human ships were already moving. Across 200 colonies and 73 orbital stations, the exodus had begun. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to push humanity too far. They had wanted humans gone, controlled or submissive. They were about to get their wish, and they would spend the next decade regretting it. Captain Taeyong stood on the bridge of the transport, vessel horizon's edge. Watching through the main viewport as the city below began to dismantle itself, New Kyoto had been humanity's pride. A colony world in the Orion Spur that had grown from a small research outpost to a thriving metropolis of 8 million people in just 30 years. Now it was being torn apart piece by piece. The evacuation fleet hung in orbit. 200 massive transport ships waiting to carry every human off the planet's surface. Smaller shuttles moved constantly between the ground and the fleet, bringing up people and cargo in an endless stream. Taeyong had been given command of the civilian evacuation, a responsibility that kept him awake at night. 8 million lives depended on his planning and execution. Down on the surface, construction robots that had built the city were now working in reverse. They dismantled buildings floor by floor, sorting materials into categories. Anything valuable was loaded onto cargo haulers for transport. Everything else was processed into raw materials or marked for destruction. The humans were leaving nothing useful behind. The other species watched from their own orbital stations, confused and increasingly nervous. The Vreniks had a trading post in the system, and their administrator kept sending messages asking what was happening. Taeyong ignored them all. His orders were clear. No communication with non-humans. No explanations, no delays in the industrial sector. Engineer Hannah supervised the demolition of the Prometheus shipyard, humanity's largest construction facility outside the solar system. The shipyard had taken 15 years to build, a massive orbital complex capable of constructing 20 starships simultaneously. It had been the heart of human expansion in this region, and now Hannah was going to erase it from existence? She walked through the main assembly hall, her magnetic boots keeping her attached to the floor as she marked critical structural points with her datapad. Teams of demolition specialists followed behind her, placing shape charges exactly where she indicated. Every support beam, every power conduit, every computer core would be destroyed in a carefully choreographed sequence. The other engineers had questioned her thoroughness. Why not just blow it up and be done with it? Hannah's answer had been simple, because they needed to make sure nothing survived. The council species could not be allowed to study human engineering, to learn the techniques that had allowed humanity to build so quickly and efficiently. Better to spend an extra week on demolition than to leave behind secrets. She stopped at the main computer core, a massive quantum processor that controlled the shipyard's automated systems. Her team had already wiped all the data, but that was not enough. She personally oversaw the removal of the processor's crystalline matrix, watching as it was loaded into a secure container. This piece of technology would be carried back to human space, where it could continue serving its purpose. Everything else would burn. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on every human world and station. On Meridian Station, families packed their belongings, while military personnel ensured that every piece of equipment was accounted for. On the agricultural colony of Harvest, farmers destroyed their crops rather than leave them for others. On the mining world of Iron Ridge, demolition charges collapsed tunnels that had taken decades to dig. The speed and coordination shocked the watching aliens. They had expected chaos, arguments, resistance from humans who did not want to leave their homes. Instead, they saw perfect discipline. Every human seemed to understand their role in the exodus. There were no protests, no debates, no delays. A Thoque cruiser approached one of the evacuation fleets, broadcasting demands that the humans stop and explain themselves. The military escort vessels simply adjusted their formation, weapon systems coming online but not targeting. The message was clear: stay back. The Thoque captain tested the boundary once, bringing his ship closer. And immediately 12 human warships moved to intercept. He retreated quickly. Back on New Kyoto, Taeyong received the final reports from the surface. All civilians had been evacuated. All equipment had been recovered or destroyed. The city that had taken 3 decades to build was now empty, its buildings stripped down to bare frameworks. He gave the order, and the demolition charges activated. From orbit, the destruction looked almost beautiful. Precise explosions brought down structures in perfect sequence, creating cascading waves of debris that fell in on themselves. Within 10 minutes, New Kyoto had been reduced to ruins. The planet would recover, its ecosystem intact. But no trace of human presence would remain. The Vrenix administrators sent one final desperate message, demanding to know why humans were destroying everything they had built. This time, Taeyong answered. He kept his response brief, because it is ours to destroy. Then he ordered the fleet to prepare for departure, as the evacuation ships gathered into formation. Taeyong looked at the planet one last time. He had lived there for 12 years, raised his children in that city, built a life among those streets, leaving hurt more than he had expected. But the alternative was worse. The Council had made their position clear. Humanity would be controlled, restricted, and diminished. Better to leave everything behind than to accept that fate. The fleet jumped to faster than light speed, joining thousands of other human vessels streaming toward the galactic rim. Behind them, they left chaos. Trade routes that had depended on human ships suddenly had no carriers. Defense pacts that had relied on human military support were now meaningless. Industries that had grown around human goods and services faced immediate collapse. The Kelroth sent ambassadors to several departing fleets, offering revised terms if humanity would reconsider. The humans did not respond. The Thoque threatened to blockade human colonies that had not yet evacuated. Human military vessels appeared in overwhelming force, and the Thoque backed down. The Vrenix apologized publicly, admitting the Council had been too harsh. The apology was ignored within 60 days. As promised, every human presence in Council space had vanished. 200 colonies evacuated. 73 stations demolished. Thousands of trade agreements dissolved. The galaxy had demanded humanity accept its place. Humanity had chosen to leave instead. The last ship to depart was Ambassador G1's personal vessel. She stood on her bridge, watching the galactic core grow smaller behind them. Ahead lay the darkness beyond the rim, where humanity would build something new. something the Council could never touch or control. Her communications officer reported that they were receiving hundreds of messages from Council species ranging from threats to pleas to offers of negotiation. G1 ordered them all deleted without being read. The time for talking had passed. Humanity had made its choice. The galaxy would have to live with the consequences. 10 years had passed since humanity vanished beyond the galactic rim. Admiral Kyung-soo stood on the bridge of the warship Defiant, staring at the holographic display showing the border between human territory and what they now called the Old Galaxy. A network of sensor stations marked the boundary, each one watching for any sign of alien intrusion. In 10 years, not a single ship had crossed that line. The Council species had made noise at first, sending scouts to probe human defenses. But those scouts had been warned away by automated systems. After a few close calls, the aliens had stopped testing. They seemed content to pretend humanity no longer existed. Kyung-soo found that interesting. The Council had spent 70 years treating humans like dangerous children who needed constant supervision. Now those same species were carefully avoiding any contact with the civilization they had driven away. He wondered what they thought had happened to humanity in the darkness beyond their borders. The truth was more remarkable than any of them could imagine. Free from Council restrictions, human science had exploded forward. The artificial intelligence research that the Council had banned as too dangerous had revolutionized every aspect of human civilization. Manufacturing, medicine, education, engineering, all of it had been transformed by AI assistance. The ship Kyung-soo commanded was proof of that progress. Defiant was 3 times faster than the best human vessels from 10 years ago, carried weapons that could tear apart a planet's surface, and had defensive shields strong enough to withstand sustained fire from an entire fleet. By old galaxy standards, it was effectively invincible. And it was just one of 500 similar warships humanity had built in the last decade. But the military advances were only part of the story. Human colonies in the deep dark, as they called their new territory, had flourished. Without Council regulations restricting where they could settle and how quickly they could expand, humanity had claimed 100 new worlds. Advanced automation meant these colonies became self-sufficient within months instead of decades. The population had grown too. Freedom from Council oversight meant families could grow as large as they wanted. Medical advances had eliminated most diseases and extended human lifespans significantly. What had been 2 billion people scattered across 200 colonies was now 8 billion. People spread across 300 thriving worlds. Researcher Dayun sat in her listening post on the edge of human space, monitoring communications from the old galaxy. The humans had not completely cut themselves off. They still watched, still listened to everything happening in Council space. Dayun had spent the last 5 years compiling reports on galactic politics, and the pattern she saw worried her. Without humanity as a common concern, the old rivalries between Council species had resurfaced. The Vrenix and Thoka had been competing for dominance before humans arrived, and that competition had resumed with increasing hostility. Border disputes that had been minor irritations were escalating into armed confrontations. Trade disagreements were turning into economic warfare. Dayun's latest report painted a grim picture. The Galactic Council was falling apart. The unity that had allowed 12 species to coexist peacefully for thousands of years was crumbling. She tracked military buildups, analyzed diplomatic communications, and watched as alliance networks began forming. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. War was coming. She sent her reports to High Command, knowing they would reach the civilian government eventually. Some humans argued they should intervene, offer to mediate the growing crisis. Most disagreed. The Council had made their choice when they tried to control humanity. Let them face the consequences without human help. On a Vrenix colony near the border with Thoke space, the first shots of what would become a galactic war were fired. A Thok mining vessel crossed into disputed territory, claiming ancient rights to the system. Vrenix defense forces ordered them to leave. The Thoke refused. The Vrenix fired warning shots. The Thoke returned fire. Within hours, both sides had called in reinforcements. Within days, the skirmish had spread to 3 neighboring systems. Within weeks, other species were choosing sides, activating old defensive pacts, and settling old grudges. The war, the galaxy, had been sliding toward for a decade, had finally begun. Dayun watched it all from her listening post, recording everything. The old galaxy was tearing itself apart, and humanity was not lifting a finger to stop it. Part of her felt guilty about that. Many humans had friends among the council species, memories of peaceful cooperation before the judgment that had driven them away. But another part of her felt coldly satisfied. The council had wanted humanity gone. Now they had their wish. And they were learning what that actually meant. Admiral Kyung-soo received updated orders from High Command. Human forces were to maintain strict neutrality. If any vessels from either side crossed into human territory seeking refuge or trying to use their space as a shortcut, they were to be turned away. Use of force was authorized, if necessary, to maintain the border. He passed those orders to his fleet and continued his patrol. Sometimes he wondered what the council leaders thought now, looking back on their decision to push humanity out. Did they regret it? Did they understand that they had given humanity the greatest gift possible, freedom to grow without limits? Probably not. In Kyung-soo's experience, most species doubled down on their mistakes rather than admit they were wrong. The council had decided humanity was dangerous and needed to be controlled. When that failed, they had probably convinced themselves that humanity's withdrawal proved they were right all along. It would take something dramatic to change their minds. That something dramatic was coming, though neither side knew it yet. As the war in council space intensified, desperate commanders would start making desperate decisions. Someone would eventually decide that human space looked like a useful strategic resource. Someone would try to cross the border with military force, and then the old galaxy would discover what humanity had become in their absence. Pilot. Sung-min flew reconnaissance missions along the border, his advanced fighter impossible to detect by council technology. He watched massive fleets maneuver and clash, ships burning and dying in the empty space between stars. The scale of the destruction was staggering. In just 3 months of fighting, the Vrenix and Thok had each lost more vessels than the entire human fleet possessed at the time of the Exodus. He recorded it all, sending the data back to military intelligence. The analysts were building detailed profiles of council military capabilities, studying their tactics and technology, not because humanity planned to join the war, but because they needed to understand what they might face if the war came to them. Sung-min flew close enough to catch sight of a major battle. Hundreds of ships on each side exchanging fire. He watched a Thok dreadnought break apart under sustained bombardment, its crew of thousands dying in seconds. He watched Vrenix fighters swarm a damaged cruiser, tearing it to pieces. The violence was brutal and wasteful. His AI co-pilot noted that neither side was fighting with particular skill or efficiency. They were simply throwing ships at each other until one side or the other ran out. Human tactical doctrine had evolved far beyond such crude methods. But the council species seemed stuck in the same patterns they had used for millennia. As Sung-min turned his fighter back toward human space, he felt grateful for the Exodus. Yes, it had been painful to abandon their homes. Yes, it had been difficult to start over in the darkness beyond the rim. But the alternative would have been so much worse. If humanity had stayed, they would be trapped in this war right now, bleeding for species that had never truly accepted them as equals. Better to be out here, strong and free, and growing stronger every day. The old galaxy had made its choice. Now, it would have to live with it. The war that had been building for months finally erupted into full galactic conflict. The Thok Dominion launched a massive invasion across the Vrenix border, committing half their entire fleet to a coordinated strike on 12 key systems simultaneously. The Vrenix, caught off guard by the scale of the attack, fell back in chaos. Within weeks, the conflict spread like fire through dry grass. The Kelroth sided with the Vrenix, invoking an ancient mutual defense treaty. 3 smaller species allied with the Thok, seeing an opportunity to settle old grievances. Neutral species found themselves forced to choose sides, as the war made neutrality impossible. The Galactic Council, which had maintained peace for 10,000 years. proved completely unable to stop the fighting. Emergency sessions devolved into shouting matches between the warring factions. Proposals for ceasefire were vetoed immediately. The institution that had judged humanity so harshly was now powerless to prevent its own members from destroying each other. Pilot Sung-min continued his reconnaissance missions, watching the war intensify. The battles grew larger and more desperate. Entire fleets were annihilated in single engagements. Colony worlds were bombarded from orbit. Civilian casualties mounted into the billions. The old galaxy was bleeding itself dry. There was no end in sight. From his safe position in human territory, Sung-min recorded everything. The tactical data would be valuable, but more importantly, humanity needed to understand just how destructive the Council species could be when they turned on each other. This was what the Council had wanted to prevent humanity from becoming, yet here they were, committing atrocities that humans had never even contemplated. The Thok pushed deep into Vrennic space, conquering system after system, but their supply lines were stretched thin, and the Vrennics counterattacked with ferocity born of desperation. The war settled into a brutal stalemate, with neither side able to achieve victory, but both refusing to negotiate. That was when Admiral Kyung-soo received the alert that would change everything. A large Thok fleet was approaching the human border at high speed. Long-range sensors counted over 2,000 vessels, including several of their largest dreadnoughts. They were not on an intercept course, not exactly, but they were getting dangerously close to the boundary. Kwang-soo brought his fleet to full alert and opened a channel to the approaching Thok. He transmitted a clear warning. They were approaching human territory, and they needed to alter course immediately. The response came back within minutes, and it was not what he expected. The Thok admiral was desperate. His fleet had just lost a major engagement with Vrennic's forces and was in full retreat. They were heavily damaged, low on fuel, and being pursued by a superior enemy force. The admiral was begging for permission to enter human space, just to pass through. Just to escape the Vrennics? Hunters behind them, Kyung-soo's answer was simple and final. No. Human space was closed to all Council species. The Thok fleet needed to find another route. He offered no apology, no explanation, no alternative suggestions. Just a flat refusal. The Thok admiral's tone changed immediately. Desperation turned to anger. He accused humanity of cowardice, of hiding behind their borders while the galaxy burned. He invoked old treaties and galactic law, claiming that all spacefaring species had obligations to provide humanitarian aid to vessels in distress. Commander Jae-hee, who was monitoring the communication from her destroyer, spoke up on the command channel. She reminded Kyung-soo that humanity had withdrawn from galactic civilization and was no longer bound by galactic law. The treaties the Thok admiral cited did not apply to them. Kyung-soo agreed and sent that information to the Thok fleet. Galactic law held no authority in human space. They had 30 seconds to begin altering their course away from the border, or they would be fired upon. The Thok admiral made a fatal miscalculation. He had watched humanity retreat 10 years ago, abandoning their colonies rather than fight. He assumed that meant humans were weak, afraid of conflict. He saw Kyung-soo's small fleet, just 15 ships, and looked at his own 2,000 vessels. Even damaged and running low on ammunition, his force was overwhelming by comparison. He gave the order to cross the border. If the humans tried to stop them, his fleet would brush them aside. If they ran, as he expected, his fleet would use human space as a safe corridor to regroup. Either way, he was taking his ships across that line. The Thok fleet crossed into human territory, ignoring the warnings, ignoring the boundary markers, ignoring everything except their desperate need to escape their pursuers. Kyung-soo gave Commander Jae-hee the authorization she had been waiting 10 years to use. She activated the defense grid that humanity had been building in secret along their entire border. Thousands of automated weapons platforms hidden in the dark between stars powered up simultaneously. The Thok fleet had 90 seconds to realize their mistake. They never got the chance. The human defense grid opened fire with weapons the Council species had never seen before. Directed energy beams that could cut through shields like paper. Missiles that moved faster than anything in the old galaxy arsenal. Kinetic rounds accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The Thoque dreadnoughts, massive vessels that had survived dozens of major battles, simply came apart. Their shields failed under the first volley. Their armor meant nothing. Within seconds, the largest warships in the Thoque fleet were debris fields expanding into space. The smaller vessels tried to scatter, tried to retreat, tried to do anything to escape. But the defense grid was everywhere, overlapping fields of fire that gave no quarter and accepted no surrender. Every Thoque ship that had crossed the border was targeted simultaneously by multiple weapons platforms. Jae-hee watched from her destroyer as 2,000 enemy vessels were systematically annihilated. Her own ship never fired a shot. The automated defenses were more than sufficient. Within 90 seconds, it was over. Not a single Thoque vessel survived. Not a single piece of wreckage was larger than a fighter craft. 2,000 ships and hundreds of thousands of crew simply ceased to exist. The Vrenix fleet that had been pursuing the Thoque arrived at the border minutes later. They stopped well short of the boundary line, sensors picking up the massive energy signatures from the human weapons platforms. They sent no messages, made no demands. They simply retreated. Carrying with them sensor data that would terrify the entire council, Kyung-Su ordered the defense grid back to standby mode and filed his report. The border had been violated, the violators had been eliminated, and human territory remained secure. High Command acknowledged his actions and ordered increased patrols along the entire boundary. Within hours, every major power in the old galaxy received the automated distress call from the Thoque fleet and the sensor data from before the signal cut out. They saw what had happened to 2,000 warships in less than 2 minutes. They saw weapons technology that exceeded their own by generations. They saw the true cost of pushing humanity into the darkness. The war in Council space continued, but now both sides carefully avoided the human border. And in the Council chambers above Arcturus Prime, the same representatives who had judged humanity 10 years ago gathered an emergency session to discuss a terrifying new reality. Humanity was not gone. Humanity was not weak. Humanity had been building something in the dark that made their own military might look primitive by comparison. The species they had driven away had become something they could no longer understand or control. The question was no longer whether humanity would return to the Council. The question was what humanity would do if the war came to their borders again. And based on what happened to the Thoque fleet, answer to that question was absolutely clear. The emergency delegation arrived at the human border. 3 days after the destruction of the Thoque fleet, 5 unarmed courier ships, each carrying representatives from different Council species, broadcasting diplomatic credentials on every frequency. They came with messages of peace, requests for dialogue, and barely concealed desperation. They waited at the boundary for 6 hours before receiving any response. Finally, a communication channel opened, and Ambassador G1 appeared on their screens. She looked older than she had 10 years ago, with gray in her hair and lines around her eyes. But her expression was the same, calm, controlled, and completely unmoved by the aliens before her. The Vrenix representative spoke first. Her crystalline voice carrying a tone of carefully practiced humility. She acknowledged that the Council had made mistakes in their previous dealings with humanity. She spoke of the value of cooperation and the importance of all spacefaring species working together for mutual benefit. She asked if humanity would be willing to discuss terms for renewed relations. Giwan listened without interruption, her face showing nothing. When the Vrenix finished, she asked a single question. What had changed? The Council had judged humanity too dangerous to exist without strict controls. They had demanded submission or exclusion. Humanity had chosen exclusion. So what exactly had changed? The Kelroth delegate tried to answer, speaking of the war and how it had made everyone reconsider old positions. The Council now understood that they had been too rigid, too quick to judge. They were prepared to offer humanity a full seat with unrestricted rights, to welcome them back as true equals. G1's response was cold. They were prepared to offer humanity what humanity had earned on their own merits 10 years ago. How generous. Did they think humans had spent a decade in the darkness waiting for permission to be equals? The delegation shifted uncomfortably. The Thoque representative, replacing the admiral who had died trying to cross the border, spoke with more honesty than the others. His people were losing the war. The Vreniks were pushing deeper into Thoque space every day. His government needed the war to end. They believed only humanity had the power to force a peace. G1 appreciated the honesty, but her answer was the same. This was not humanity's war. The Council species had started this conflict themselves, and they would have to end it themselves. Director Wujian watched the meeting from his office on Earth, analyzing every word and gesture. He had spent 10 years overseeing humanity's transformation in the deep dark, coordinating the expansion that had turned a desperate exodus into a thriving civilization. He knew exactly how far ahead of the Council humanity had pulled, and he knew they could never catch up. On the screen, the delegation was becoming more desperate. They spoke of civilian casualties, of entire species facing extinction, of the breakdown of galactic order. Surely humanity felt some responsibility to help, some obligation to prevent suffering on such a massive scale. G1's answer cut through their appeals like a knife. Humanity had left galactic civilization by choice. They had no legal obligations to Council species, no treaties binding them to intervention, no responsibility for a war they had not started and had nothing to do with. The galaxy had wanted them gone. The galaxy had gotten exactly what it asked for. The Vreniks representative tried a different approach. She asked about trade, about the possibility of economic cooperation, even without formal diplomatic relations. Human goods and services had been valuable before the Exodus. Surely there were opportunities for mutual profit. G1 almost smiled at that. So now the Council wanted access to human technology and resources, after spending 70 years trying to limit human development. The answer was no. Humanity was entirely self-sufficient now. They had no need for galactic markets, and they had no interest in sharing. The fruits of their independence, with the species that had tried to control them, the delegation made one final plea. Would humanity at least agree to remain neutral? To not take sides if the war continued? To allow Council ships to pass near human borders without fear of attack? G1's response was precise and uncompromising. Human borders would be defended with absolute force against any incursion, as the Thoque fleet had discovered. Beyond those borders, humanity had no interest in Council affairs. They would not join the war on either side. They would not intervene to stop it. They would simply watch as the old galaxy resolved its problems without them. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. The delegation protested, asking for more time, more discussion, more consideration. G1 ignored them all. She delivered her final statement clearly and without emotion. Humanity had been pushed into the darkness, and they had thrived there. They had built a civilization free from Council interference and Council limitations. They had advanced beyond anything the old galaxy could match or understand, and they had absolutely no intention of ever returning to the system that had rejected them. The communication channel closed. The delegation sat in their ships at the border, realizing they had failed completely. They had come hoping to convince humanity to return, or at least to help with the war. Instead, they had learned that humanity did not care what happened to them. The indifference was worse than hostility. On Earth, Director Wujin reviewed the conversation with his advisory council. Some members argued that humanity should reconsider. They had a moral obligation to help prevent the extinction of entire species. Others pointed out that the Council had shown humanity no mercy when they were vulnerable, and deserved none now. Wujin sided with the second group. Humanity had to think of its own survival and growth first. The Council species had made their choices, and now they would live with the consequences. If the war destroyed their civilization, humanity would still thrive in the deep dark. If they somehow found peace, humanity would still remain separate and independent. The delegation reported their failure back to the Council. The meeting that followed was bitter and divided. Some species called for immediate military action against humanity, arguing that such a powerful civilization could not be allowed to exist outside Council control. Others pointed out that the automated defense grid had destroyed 2,000 ships in 90 seconds, and any military action would be suicide. A third faction suggested waiting. Humanity would eventually need something the Council could provide. When that happened, negotiations could resume from a position of strength. This group was ignored because everyone in the room understood the truth. Humanity would never need anything from them again. In the deep dark, Admiral Kungsu received new orders. Fleet Command had concluded that the war in Council space would eventually produce a desperate enough faction to attempt another border crossing. His forces were to be expanded and placed on permanent high alert. No more warnings would be given. Any vessel crossing the border would be destroyed immediately. He passed those orders to his captains and continued his patrol. Sometimes he wondered if the Council species understood what had really happened. They seemed to think humanity had simply moved away and built some better weapons. They did not grasp that humanity had fundamentally transformed in their absence. The species in the old galaxy were ancient, set in their ways, bound by traditions and regulations that had barely changed in thousands of years. They had reached a comfortable level of technology and decided to stop pushing forward. The Council existed to maintain that comfortable stagnation. Humanity had never been comfortable. Humans pushed boundaries by nature, always seeking to improve and advance and grow. The Council's restrictions had been slowly strangling that nature. The Exodus had freed humanity to be what they truly were, a species that refused to accept limits. 10 years of unrestricted development had produced advances. The Council could not match in a century. Another 10 years would put humanity so far ahead that the old galaxy would seem primitive by comparison. The gap would only continue to grow. Pilot Sungmin flew his reconnaissance missions, watching the war continue. The fighting had intensified after the failed diplomatic mission. Both sides seemed to be rushing toward some decisive final battle, though it was unclear if either had the strength left to win such an engagement.